3 weeks had passed since the destruction of the Kreth supply depot. The Coalition had used that time to reinforce their positions, repair their damaged vessels, and prepare for the retaliation they knew was coming. Intelligence reports showed that the Kreth Dominion was gathering every ship they had left for one final, desperate assault on the Velthari homeworld. If they could destroy the heart of the Coalition, they believed they could still win the war. The 4 humans stood on the bridge of Hope of Veltharis as the Kreth fleet emerged from hyperspace. There were hundreds of enemy vessels, every warship the Dominion could gather. It was a terrifying sight, a wave of destruction aimed directly at a world of billions. Grace Patterson looked at her companions. They were exhausted. Carl Bennett still walked with a limp from wounds that had not fully healed. Daniel Hayes had barely slept in days, coordinating ground defenses across the planet. Linda Torres had trained pilots until her voice was hoarse. They were old. They were tired. Their bodies were failing them, but their spirits remained unbroken. "One more battle," Grace said quietly. "One more time." The Kreth attacked with the fury of a dying empire. They had nothing left to lose. Their supply lines were gone. Their occupied systems were crumbling. If they could not take the Velthari homeworld, their entire invasion would collapse. They came with everything they had. The Coalition fleet met them in orbit. Grace Patterson commanded the defense with the calm precision that had made her legendary. She had studied the Kreth for weeks now. She knew how they thought, how they reacted, how they made decisions under pressure. She used that knowledge against them. Coalition ships moved in patterns that the Kreth could not predict. Defensive positions shifted constantly, denying the enemy any stable target. When Kreth forces concentrated for a breakthrough, Coalition reinforcements appeared to block them. When Kreth vessels tried to flank, they found themselves caught in crossfire. Linda Torres flew her fighter until the engines burned out from overuse. She ejected, was picked up by a Coalition rescue craft, transferred to another fighter, and launched again within minutes. She had lost count of how many enemy vessels she had destroyed. She only knew that more kept coming. On the planet below, Daniel Hayes coordinated ground defenses with desperate efficiency. Kreth landing forces made it through the orbital battle, dropping troops across the Velthari homeworld. Hayes had prepared for this. He had positioned defensive units, evacuation routes, and fallback positions. Every time the Kreth advanced, they met resistance. Every time they broke through, they found the next position waiting. Carl Bennett led strike teams against Kreth command units. Despite his injuries, despite his age, he moved through the battlefield with deadly purpose. Young Coalition soldiers followed him with something like worship in their eyes. They had heard the stories of what he had done on the supply depot. Now they were seeing it firsthand. The battle raged for hours. Both sides took terrible losses. The space around the Velthari homeworld became a graveyard of broken ships and floating debris. On the ground, entire cities were evacuated while soldiers fought street by street to slow the enemy advance. Then the Kreth flagship broke through the Coalition defensive line. It was a massive vessel, larger than any other ship in either fleet. Its weapons were already charging for a planetary bombardment that would kill billions. Coalition ships moved to intercept, but none of them could reach it in time. Linda Torres was the closest. Her current fighter was badly damaged, trailing smoke and sparks. Her weapons systems were barely functional, but she was still flying, and she could see the flagship approaching the planet. She set a collision course. If she could hit the weapons array at the right angle, at the right speed, she might be able to disable it before it could fire. She would not survive the impact. She knew that. She accepted it. "Linda, no." Grace's voice came through the communication channel, filled with emotion she rarely showed. "There has to be another way." "There is not," Linda replied calmly. "Take care of the others, Grace. Tell them I was not afraid." She accelerated toward the flagship. On the bridge of Hope of Velthoris, the crew watched in helpless horror. Ambassador Thelia stood beside Grace Patterson, his hands trembling. Then a coalition cruiser appeared on the tactical display, moving faster than any vessel its size should be able to move. It was commanded by a young Velthori captain named Keth, the same soldier who had spoken with Carl Bennett during the training days. He had heard the humans' words about carrying memories. He had learned what it meant to fight for something larger than yourself. His cruiser rammed the Kreth flagship at full speed. The collision was catastrophic. Both vessels were destroyed instantly, tearing each other apart in an explosion that lit up the sky above the Velthori homeworld. The flagship's weapons never fired. Billions of lives were saved. Linda Torres pulled out of her collision course at the last second, her fighter spinning wildly from the shockwave. She regained control and turned back toward the remaining Kreth forces, tears streaming down her face for the young captain who had sacrificed himself. The destruction of the flagship broke the Kreth assault. Their remaining ships began to retreat, their coordination shattered, their will to fight finally exhausted. The invasion was over. The coalition had won. In the days that followed, celebration spread across the 12 systems. The Kreth Dominion, crippled beyond recovery, sued for peace. The worlds they had conquered began the slow process of rebuilding. And the 4 humans who had made it all possible were honored in a ceremony attended by representatives from every coalition species. Ambassador Thelia spoke before the assembled crowd. We called for backup. We expected an army. Instead, we received 4 individuals who taught us what it means to fight. Not just with weapons, but with heart, with experience, with unbreakable will. They showed us that legends are not beings who cannot be killed. They are beings who choose to stand when everyone else has fallen. Grace Patterson accepted the coalition's highest honor on behalf of her team. She stood straight and proud, though her body ached with exhaustion. Beside her, Daniel Hayes smiled quietly. Linda Torres wiped tears from her eyes. Carl Bennett stood in silence, his face unreadable. When the ceremony asked them to speak, only Carl came forward. The same man who had said almost nothing for weeks suddenly had words that needed to be shared. We came because someone had to, he said, his voice rough but clear. That is what humans do. We came because legends are not about being immortal. They are about being willing to give everything for something larger than yourself. The young captain who saved this world understood that. He was not human, but he fought like one. He died like one. He will be remembered like one. Carl paused, his eyes moving across the assembled crowd of a dozen different species. Remember us if you wish, but remember him more. Remember that courage belongs to no single species. Remember that anyone can become a legend if they are willing to pay the price. In the years that followed, the 4 humans found peace in different ways. Grace Patterson retired to a small house on the Velthori homeworld, where she taught military history to young officers from across the coalition. Daniel Hayes returned to his farm on Mars, but he kept in regular contact with coalition ground forces who considered him their honorary commander. Linda Torres accepted a position training the next generation of coalition pilots, finding purpose and passing on her skills to beings who would carry them into the future. Carl Bennett traveled. He visited every world that had been touched by the war, speaking with survivors, learning their stories, helping them heal. He never stopped carrying the weight of those he could not save. But now he also carried the knowledge that he had helped save billions more. On the Velthori homeworld, children began playing a game called Human Legends. They would pretend to be brave old warriors fighting against impossible odds, teaching each other the stories of Grace, Daniel, Linda, and Carl. The game spread to other coalition worlds, adapted by different species, but always carrying the same message, the story of the 4 humans. who answered the call became part of galactic mythology. It was told in schools and military academies, in homes and gathering places across 12 star systems. It reminded everyone who heard it that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from numbers or weapons, but from the courage of those who refuse to give up. And somewhere on Earth, new generations of soldiers grew up hearing tales of the living legends who proved that determination, experience, and heart can change the fate of worlds. They trained harder. They studied more. They prepared themselves for the day when someone, somewhere, might call for backup, because that is what humans do. The Coalition fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation. 200 vessels of various sizes and designs, carrying soldiers from 12 different species, all united by a single purpose. Ahead of them, the Kreth supply depot hung in the darkness of space like a mechanical moon. And surrounding it, more than 500 enemy warships waited. Grace Patterson stood on the bridge of the Coalition flagship, a massive vessel called Hope of Vulthuris. Around her, alien officers worked at their stations with nervous energy. They had never attempted an operation of this scale. They had never deliberately attacked a defended enemy position. Everything about this battle went against their training and instincts. Grace activated the fleet-wide communication channel. Her voice reached every ship, every soldier, every pilot preparing for combat. Today we do what they said was impossible. Today we prove that courage matters more than numbers. Today we teach the Kreth that the galaxy will not fall quietly. She paused, letting her words sink in. Every one of you has lost something to this enemy. Friends, family, homes. Today we take our revenge. Today we fight not just for survival, but for victory. All ships, engage. The battle began. Linda Torres led the fighter squadrons in the first wave of the assault. 300 small craft screamed toward the Kreth defensive line, their weapons blazing. The Kreth responded with overwhelming fire, filling the space between the fleets with deadly energy. Fighters on both sides began to fall, but the Coalition pilots had been trained by Linda Torres. They did not fly in the predictable patterns the Kreth expected. They wove and spun through the enemy fire, using techniques that seemed impossible. They targeted Kreth command ships, blinding their coordination systems. They created openings for the larger vessels to exploit. Linda herself was a storm of destruction. Her fighter moved through the Kreth formation like a blade through water, leaving burning wreckage in her wake. Enemy pilots tried to track her, but she was always somewhere else, always one step ahead. Decades of experience guided her hands. Centuries of human combat doctrine lived in her instincts. Behind the fighters, the Coalition capital ships engaged the main Kreth fleet. Grace Patterson commanded from the flagship, her orders coming fast and precise. Small squadrons drew enemy forces out of position. Heavy cruisers struck at exposed flanks. Destroyers harassed enemy supply lines. The Kreth had expected a desperate, uncoordinated attack. Instead, they faced a perfectly orchestrated assault. On the surface of the supply depot, the ground assault began. Daniel Hayes led Coalition forces in landing craft that dropped through enemy fire to reach the station. Kreth defenders were numerous and well fortified. They had prepared for this possibility, building defensive positions that should have been impenetrable. Hayes had studied those defenses for days. He knew their weaknesses. He led his forces through paths the Kreth had not expected, using terrain and structures as cover. When they encountered enemy positions, they did not charge directly. They flanked, surrounded, and overwhelmed. Coalition soldiers who had trained under Hayes fought with new confidence, using tactics that humans had developed over thousands of years of warfare. The Kreth defenders began to fall back. They were not used to this kind of fighting. They were used to fear and surrender. They were used to enemies who broke under pressure. These Coalition soldiers did not break. They pushed forward with relentless determination, but the depot's central reactor was heavily guarded. The main Kreth defensive force had concentrated there, understanding that if the reactor was destroyed, the entire station would fall. Coalition forces threw themselves at these defenses again and again, but could not break through. Casualties mounted. Time was running out. Carl Bennett approached Daniel Hayes with a simple statement. "I will go alone." Hayes shook his head. "That is suicide. There are hundreds of Kreth between here and the reactor." Carl checked his weapons one final time. There were thousands on New Jakarta. "I made it through then." He met his old friend's eyes. "You know there is no other way. We need that reactor to overload. I am the only one who can get there in time." Hayes wanted to argue. He wanted to find another solution. But he had served with Carl Bennett for over 30 years. He knew when the man had made up his mind. He knew that sometimes legends had to do legendary things. "Come back alive," Hayes said quietly. Carl nodded once, then disappeared into the shadows. The next 20 minutes would become the stuff of military legend. Carl Bennett moved through Kreth defensive lines like a ghost. He used every technique he had learned in 37 combat deployments. He used every trick, every skill, every ounce of experience he possessed. Kreth soldiers fell without ever seeing their attacker. Security systems failed before they could raise alarms. Doors that should have been impenetrable opened before him. He reached the reactor control room covered in blood, most of it not his own. His body ached from wounds he had collected along the way. But his hands were steady as he accessed the reactor controls and began the overload sequence. The alarm started immediately. Kreth forces converged on his position. Carl found a defensible corridor and prepared to hold it for as long as necessary. He had no expectation of escape. He had made peace with that possibility long ago, though his transmission reached the fleet above. Charges set. Reactor overloading. Dead clear. Grace Patterson received the message on the flagship bridge. She immediately ordered all coalition forces to begin withdrawal. The depot would explode within minutes, and anything too close would be caught in the blast. Ships began pulling back. Landing craft retrieved ground forces. The battle was won, but the cost was becoming clear. Daniel Hayes received the withdrawal order. He looked toward the depot's interior, toward the place where his oldest friend was making his last stand. He made a decision that would have been called insubordination in any other context. He gathered a small team of volunteers and headed back into the depot. They found Carl Bennett still fighting. He had been holding the corridor for 11 minutes against constant Kreth assault. His ammunition was nearly exhausted. His armor was torn. But he was still standing, still fighting, still refusing to fall. Hayes and his team hit the Kreth from behind, breaking their attack. They reached Carl and pulled him back, half carrying him toward the landing zone. Behind them, the reactor began its final cascade. They barely made it to the last landing craft before the depot began to tear itself apart. From the flagship, Grace Patterson watched the explosion spread across the tactical display. The supply depot was gone. The Kreth ships caught in the blast radius were gone. The enemy's ability to sustain their invasion had been destroyed in a single, brilliant flash. The coalition fleet had suffered heavy losses. Nearly 60 ships had been destroyed. Thousands of soldiers had fallen. But they had won. They had actually won. Reports came in from across the battlefield. Surviving Kreth forces were retreating in disorder. Without coordination from their command ships, without supplies from the depot, they had no way to continue the fight. The impossible had happened. Grace Patterson allowed herself a moment of relief. Then she turned to the communications officer. "Get me casualty reports. Find out if Colonel Hayes made it out." The wait felt endless. Then a transmission came through from one of the landing craft. Daniel Hayes appeared on screen, exhausted and bloodied, but alive. And behind him, barely conscious but breathing, was Carr Bennett. "Mission accomplished," Hayes said with a tired smile. "The legends are coming home." Grace felt tears forming in her eyes. She pushed them back. There would be time for emotion later. For now, there was still a war to finish. "All ships," she broadcast to the fleet, "set course for the Velthory system. We have won the battle, but the Kreth will not accept defeat easily. Prepare for what comes next." The Coalition fleet turned toward home, leaving behind the burning remains of their enemies' hopes. They had done the impossible. Now they had to do it again. The war room of Coalition Command Station 17 was the largest chamber on the entire structure. Holographic displays covered every surface, showing real-time information from across the 12 Coalition systems. Representatives from every member species sat at a circular table, their faces showing a mixture of hope and skepticism. After Linda Torres and her impossible victory, they could no longer dismiss the humans entirely. But neither could they believe that 4 elderly warriors could turn the tide of a war that had already claimed millions of lives. Grace Patterson stood at the center of the room. The holographic star map glowed around her, showing the positions of Coalition and Kreth forces across the galaxy. She had spent 3 days studying this map, learning every detail, understanding every weakness. Now she was ready to share her plan. "The Coalition has been fighting this war incorrectly from the beginning," she said. Her voice was calm, but carried the authority of someone who had commanded fleets in battles that shaped human history. "You have been thinking like defenders. You react to Kreth attacks. You spread your forces thin to protect every threatened system. You wait for the enemy to come to you." General Morath of the Tellurians interrupted. "What else can we do? The Kreth outnumber us. We cannot launch offensive operations against such a superior force." Grace shook her head. "Numbers are not the only factor in war. The Kreth have a weakness. Every military force has a weakness. Theirs is supply." She gestured, and the holographic display shifted to show a single location deep in Kreth-controlled space. This is their primary supply depot. Every weapon, every fuel cell, every replacement part for their entire invasion force comes through this station. Destroy it, and their advance stops. Their occupied systems become burdens instead of assets. They will have to pull back or starve. Admiral Vexus of the Aquari floated forward in her water tank. "That depot is heavily defended. We would need to commit our entire remaining fleet to have any chance of reaching it. And while our fleet is there, who will protect our homeworlds?" "No one," Grace said simply. The room erupted in protest. Coalition commanders shouted over each other, their various languages mixing into chaos. The very idea of leaving their homeworlds undefended was unthinkable. It went against every principle of Coalition military doctrine. Grace waited for the noise to subside. When she spoke again, her voice was harder. "The Kreth expect you to keep defending. They expect you to keep reacting. That is why they are winning. If you want to survive, you must do what they do not expect. You must attack." Daniel Hayes stepped forward to stand beside Grace. "I have studied Kreth ground tactics," he said. "They are aggressive but predictable. They rely on overwhelming force and fear. They do not adapt well when their plans fail. If we hit them hard enough, fast enough, they will not know how to respond." Commander Zeth of the Karathi laughed bitterly. Easy words from humans who have never faced the Kreth in battle. Carl Bennett spoke for the first time since arriving at the station. His voice was quiet, but something in it made everyone stop and listen. "I have faced enemies like the Kreth on New Shanghai, on the moons of Jupiter, on a dozen worlds you have never heard of. They come with numbers and fury. They think that makes them unbeatable." He paused. They are wrong. They always are. General Morth leaned forward. You truly believe this plan can work? You would risk everything on a single strike? Grace met his eyes. Yes, because the alternative is certain defeat. You can die slowly, watching your worlds fall one by one. Or you can take a chance. You can fight back. You can show the Kreth that the Coalition will not surrender quietly. The room fell silent. Ambassador Thelius watched the Coalition commanders wrestling with this impossible choice. Everything they had been taught said to defend, to protect, to preserve. But their defenses were crumbling. Their protection was failing. Their preservation was becoming extinction. Finally, Admiral Vexus spoke. I will commit the Aquari fleet to this operation. One by one, the other commanders followed. General Morth, Commander Zeth, representatives from species that had lost worlds and loved ones to the Kreth. They were afraid. They were uncertain. But they were also tired of losing. If these humans believed victory was possible, they would follow. The decision was made. The Coalition would attack. Over the following days, the four humans worked tirelessly to prepare for the assault. Grace Patterson refined the battle strategy with Coalition admirals, teaching them tactics that humans had developed over centuries of warfare. She showed them how to coordinate between different fleet elements, how to create diversions, how to concentrate force at critical moments. Daniel Hayes trained ground forces in methods they had never imagined: ambushes, guerrilla tactics, fighting from positions of weakness instead of strength. Coalition soldiers were used to standing in formation, meeting the enemy directly. Hayes taught them to hide, to strike from shadows, to turn the enemy's advantages against them. Linda Torres worked with Coalition pilots until they could barely stand. She pushed them beyond their limits, beyond what they believed possible. She showed them that a fighter was more than a machine. It was an extension of the pilot's will. Those who flew with her came back changed, their confidence transformed. Carl Bennett trained Special Forces units. He spoke little, but his lessons were powerful. He showed them how to move without being seen, how to strike without warning, how to survive when survival seemed impossible. Young soldiers who trained with him developed a respect that bordered on fear. They had never met anyone who could do the things Carl Bennett could do. One evening, a young Velthari soldier named Keth approached Carl as he sat alone in the training area. Keth was barely an adult by his species standards, but he had already lost his entire family to the Kreth. Why do you fight? Keth asked. You are old. You have lived a long life. This is not your war. Carl was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with memory. I fight because I remember everyone I could not save. Every soldier who died beside me. Every civilian I was too late to protect. I carry them with me always. He looked at the young Velthari. I fight so that you will not have to carry as many memories as I do. Keth did not fully understand, but he felt the weight of those words. He nodded and returned to his training with new determination. On the third day of preparations, intelligence reports arrived with urgent news. The Kreth had learned about the human advisors. They were accelerating their invasion timeline. Their main fleet was moving faster than expected. The attack on the supply depot had to happen now, in 3 days instead of 3 weeks. Grace Patterson gathered her fellow humans. They were exhausted from days of preparation. Their bodies ached with the effort of training younger beings. But when she told them the timeline had changed, none of them hesitated. We have worked with worse deadlines, Linda Torres said with a tired smile. Daniel Hayes nodded. The troops are as ready as they will ever be. Carl Bennett said nothing, but he began checking his equipment. That was answer enough. Grace looked at her companions, these legends who had answered the call. They were old. They were tired. But they were not finished. Then we launch in 3 days, she said. May whatever gods are listening watch over us all. Coalition Command Station 17 was a massive structure floating in orbit around the Velthary homeworld. It had been built as a center of trade and diplomacy, a place where the 12 species of the Coalition could meet and conduct business in peace. Now it had become something else entirely. Refugees crowded every corridor. Wounded soldiers filled every medical bay. The sounds of crying children and dying warriors echoed through halls that had once known only quiet conversation. Grace Patterson walked through these halls with her eyes open and her mind working. She had seen such scenes before. During the border conflicts of 2089, during the colony rebellions of 2112, during the dark days after the Mars incident. Suffering was universal, she had learned. It looked the same on every species, on every world. The other 3 humans followed behind her. Daniel Hayes stopped frequently to speak with refugees, learning their stories, asking about the enemy's tactics. His face remained gentle, but his eyes were sharp. Every piece of information was being stored away for later use. Linda Torres examined every ship and fighter they passed, noting damage patterns and repair quality. Carl Bennett said nothing at all. He simply watched everything with the quiet attention of a predator studying its environment. The Coalition commanders had given the humans a small conference room to use as their quarters. It was an insult, really. A room meant for minor trade negotiations, barely large enough for the 4 of them to sit together. But Grace accepted it without complaint. She had fought wars from smaller spaces than this. Ambassador Thelius visited them on the 2nd day. He found Grace standing before a holographic display of the Coalition's tactical situation, her eyes moving across star systems and fleet positions. She had been studying the display for 16 hours straight without rest. "You see the problem?" Thelius said quietly. Grace nodded. "Your forces are spread too thin. You are trying to defend everything at once. That means you can protect nothing. Effectively, we cannot abandon systems to the Kreth. Billions of lives depend on our protection, and billions more will die if you continue this strategy." Grace turned to face him. "The Kreth are not stupid. They see your weakness. They attack in multiple locations, forcing you to divide your fleet. Then they concentrate their forces against your weakest point and break through. You lose the system anyway, along with the ships you sent to defend it." Thelius felt a chill run through him. This human had identified in 2 days what Coalition strategists had failed to see in 3 months. "What would you do differently?" Before Grace could answer, alarms began to sound throughout the station. Emergency lights flashed red. A voice announced in multiple languages that a Kreth raiding party had been detected attacking a civilian convoy near the station. Coalition fighters were scrambling to intercept, but the convoy was already under heavy fire. They would arrive too late. Linda Torres was moving before anyone else could react. She ran through the corridors toward the fighter base, her body moving with a speed that seemed impossible for a woman of 45. Grace called after her, but Linda did not stop. She reached the bay, found a Coalition fighter, and climbed inside without asking permission. A Velthary technician tried to stop her. "You cannot take that vessel. It is not yours. You are not trained on Coalition systems." Linda looked at the controls. They were different from human designs, certainly. But a fighter was a fighter. The principles were the same: thrust, weapons, targeting. She had flown over 30 different craft in her career. She would learn this one in the time it took to reach the battle. The fighter launched before anyone could prevent it. In the combat zone, the civilian convoy was dying. 6 transport ships carrying refugees from a fallen colony were surrounded by 14 Kreth fighters. The Kreth were not simply attacking. They were playing with their prey. damaging engines and life support systems, forcing the civilians to drift helplessly while they picked the ships apart piece by piece. Linda arrived alone. Her coalition fighter was small compared to the Kreth vessels. Her weapons were designed for escort duty, not heavy combat. Any reasonable pilot would have called for backup and waited. Linda Torres had never been a reasonable pilot. She hit the first Kreth fighter before they even knew she was there. Her approach had used the debris field as cover, coming in low and fast where their sensors would have difficulty tracking her. The Kreth vessel exploded, and suddenly the hunters became hunted. The Kreth turned to engage her. 14 against 1. Those were odds that would terrify any coalition pilot. Linda felt only the familiar calm that always came when she was in combat. Her hands moved across the controls as if she had flown this ship her entire life. She rolled, dove, climbed, and spun in patterns that seemed to defy physics. The Kreth could not track her. Every time they thought they had a firing solution, she was already somewhere else. Their shots hit empty space while her weapons found their targets with deadly precision. One Kreth fighter fell, then another. Then 3 more in rapid succession. On the station, coalition officers watched in stunned silence. Ambassador Thelius stood beside Grace Patterson, his mouth hanging open. "How is she doing that?" he whispered. Grace watched the display with something like pride in her eyes. "She has been flying combat missions since before most of your pilots were born. She has survived battles that killed everyone else in her squadron. She has learned from every enemy she ever faced." Grace paused, and she is very, very angry that someone would attack helpless refugees. On the tactical display, another Kreth fighter exploded. Then another. Within 6 minutes of her arrival, Linda Torres had destroyed 11 enemy vessels. The remaining 3 Kreth fighters broke formation and fled, their sensors showing them that this single opponent was more dangerous than anything they had ever encountered. Convoy was saved. Linda Torres returned to the station and landed her borrowed fighter without ceremony. She climbed out of the cockpit, walked past the crowd of coalition pilots and officers who had gathered to watch, and returned to the conference room where her companions waited. She sat down in her chair and closed her eyes. "Engines pull to the left," she said. "Weapons targeting is slow. Needs recalibration." Then she fell asleep. Ambassador Thelius entered the room a moment later. His hands were shaking. He had just witnessed something that would be remembered for generations. A single human pilot had defeated 14 enemy fighters and saved thousands of lives, while the entire coalition fleet stood frozen. He looked at Grace Patterson with new eyes. "How?" was all he could manage to say. Grace smiled. "She is a legend, Ambassador. They all are. And now, would you like to hear our plan to win this war?" Thelius nodded slowly. For the first time since the invasion began, he allowed himself to feel real hope. These 4 elderly humans were not what he had expected. They were something far more dangerous. They were exactly what the coalition needed. The transmission came from the far edge of the galaxy, carried across countless light years until it reached the blue planet called Earth. Ambassador Thelius of the Velthari Coalition stood before his communication screen with trembling hands. His pale blue skin had grown even paler in recent months. His large dark eyes, which once held the confidence of a diplomat who had negotiated peace between star systems, now showed only desperation. Behind him, through the viewport of Coalition Command Station 17, he could see the burning wreckage of another destroyed fleet drifting through space. The Kreth Dominion had come without warning 3 months ago. They were a species that knew only conquest and consumption. They did not negotiate. They did not accept surrender. They simply took what they wanted and destroyed everything else. 7 star systems had already fallen. Billions of lives had been lost. The coalition, an alliance of 12 spacefaring species that had maintained peace for over 1,000 years, was crumbling. Thelius had tried everything. He had called upon ancient allies. He had begged neutral powers for assistance. He had even attempted to negotiate with the Kreth themselves, though his diplomatic vessel barely escaped their weapons. Now he was making the most desperate call of all. He was reaching out to the humans. The humans were strange creatures from a harsh world. Earth was a planet of extreme temperatures, violent weather, and dangerous predators. The humans had evolved there, fighting for survival against their own environment for millions of years. They had only recently joined the galactic community, less than 200 years ago. But in that short time, stories had spread about them. Stories that many species found hard to believe. They said humans could endure pain that would kill other beings. They said humans formed bonds of loyalty that could not be broken. They said humans would fight until their last breath, even when victory was impossible. Most disturbing of all, they said humans actually enjoyed combat. They treated war as an art form to be studied and perfected over generations. Thelius did not know if these stories were true, but he had no other options left. The screen flickered and a human face appeared. It was a woman with gray hair and sharp eyes. She introduced herself as Admiral Grace Patterson, retired, currently serving as a consultant to the United Defense Council. Thelius began his plea immediately. He described the Kreth invasion. He explained the coalition's losses. He begged for military assistance. Grace Patterson listened without interruption. When Thelius finished, she asked a single question. "What exactly do you need, Ambassador?" Thelius hesitated. He had prepared a formal request for ships and soldiers, for weapons and supplies. But looking into this human's eyes, he found himself speaking honestly. "We need warriors," he said, "not ordinary soldiers. We need your best. The ones who have faced impossible odds and survived. The ones other humans speak about with respect and fear. We need legends." Grace Patterson was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "I understand, Ambassador. Give me 48 hours. Help is coming." Thelius felt a small spark of hope. "How many ships will you send? How many soldiers?" The human woman smiled, and something in that smile made Thelius feel uneasy. "You asked for legends, Ambassador. Legends do not come in large numbers." 2 days later, a single human transport vessel arrived at Coalition Command Station 17. Thelius had gathered the senior military commanders of all 12 coalition species to greet their reinforcements. General Morath of the Tellurians stood at the front, his massive armored body blocking the view of smaller species behind him. Admiral Vexus of the Aquari floated in her water tank, her tentacles pressed against the glass in anticipation. Commander Zeth of the Karathi checked and rechecked his weapons, eager to see what human warriors looked like. The transport's boarding ramp lowered. Everyone waited to see the army that would save them. 4 humans walked down the ramp. Thelius felt his heart sink. 4. The humans had sent only 4 individuals. And these were not the young, strong warriors he had imagined. These were old. Their hair was gray or white. Their faces carried lines from decades of life. They moved slowly, carefully, as if their bodies ached with every step. General Morath made a sound of disgust. "This is what the humans send? 4 elderly specimens? We asked for an army." The human at the front of the group was the same woman Thelius had spoken with, Admiral Grace Patterson. She was 67 years old, and she had once held off a pirate armada for 42 days with a skeleton crew at Proxima Station. Behind her walked Colonel Daniel Hayes, 58 years old, the man who had led 12,000 civilians through enemy territory during the impossible retreat from New Shanghai. Next came Captain Linda Torres, 45 years old, an ace pilot with 200 confirmed kills who had survived the Battle of the Kuiper Belt Last was Sergeant Major Carl Bennett, 61 years old, the most decorated enlisted soldier in human history. Veteran of 37 combat deployments, the Coalition commanders did not know these histories. They saw only 4 old humans who seemed barely capable of walking, let alone fighting a war. Admiral Vexis spoke through her translation device. Ambassador Thelius, surely there has been some mistake. These cannot be the reinforcements we requested. Grace Patterson stepped forward before Thelius could respond. Her voice was calm and clear. There is no mistake. You asked for legends. Here we are. Commander Zeth laughed openly. Legends? You are old and few. The Kreth have thousands of warships and millions of soldiers. What can 4 elderly humans do against such an enemy? Grace Patterson met his eyes without flinching. We can win. The Coalition commanders exchanged looks of disbelief and frustration. Some began walking away, dismissing the humans entirely. General Morith shook his massive head. This is a waste of time. We will continue our defense without human assistance. But Thelius remained. He studied the 4 humans carefully. They did not seem offended by the mockery. They did not seem worried about the overwhelming odds against them. They stood with a quiet confidence that reminded Thelius of something he had almost forgotten. They stood like beings who had seen the impossible before and had made it possible anyway. Admiral Patterson, Thelius said slowly, why did you come? You are retired. This is not your war. Why would you leave your homes to fight for species you have never met? Grace Patterson looked at her 3 companions. Daniel Hayes, who had left his peaceful farm on Mars without hesitation. Linda Torres, who had climbed back into a cockpit she thought she would never see again. Carl Bennett, who had packed his bag without saying a word to anyone. They had all answered the call. They were old. They were tired. They carried wounds that would never fully heal, both on their bodies and in their minds. But they had come. Grace turned back to Thelius. Because someone had to, she said simply. Because that is what humans do. We fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. We stand when others fall. And we never, ever give up. She looked toward the tactical displays showing the Coalition's desperate situation. Now, Ambassador, take us to your war room. We have work to do.